this is who I am. This is what suffering is. This is what we've got wrong about suffering, and there's hope for you in the middle of it. God's actually doing something for you, and he's using this opportunity to shape and mold you to bring him closer unto himself. This world is not our home. Then you bring it on the second volume, a much more robust theological understanding of it. You root it in creation, fall, and redemption, and then consummation. And I thought, as I was reading that, I thought, okay, it's going to sound terrible, but that's kind of the typical way of looking at it. But you put a different spin on it. Once again, you put a different spin, even when you went through the consequences of the fall. And I thought, okay, of course we have the consequences of the fall. We have man, he's working hard. But when you hit the woman and her consequences of her suffering, I went, oh boy, what are we going to do here? And then you mentioned childbirth and childbearing. Okay, again, no issue. But then you bring it into parenthood. And I thought, whoa, this explains a lot to me. Describe a little bit of that and why you brought that up, because I think a lot of parents need to hear this.
Yeah, I got it from Alan Ross, who is a great commentator on scripture. He wrote one book on Genesis called Creation and Blessing, and he's written 3 volumes on the Psalms. He's got a commentary on Leviticus. He's the one who mentions that the Hebrew word that is usually used for childbirth actually probably doesn't mean that. It refers to the whole of rearing children. And the importance of that is that as wonderful as rearing children is, it includes lots of sorrows, and it includes lots of worries, and so on and so forth. And if we don't recognize that, then we're not going to be prepared for the fact that God is again asking us to depend upon him, both for ourselves and for our children. One of my points when I'm talking about the doom that God spoke to the woman is that there is always going to be friction in marriage. That is part of what has come out of the fall. And the reason that's so important is that without that, it would be particularly possible, especially for women who I think have a stronger desire for the kind of deep personal relationship that they want to have with their husbands. They need to realize that this life and this relationship is not going to be paradise, that there are always going to be hard things within it. Sometimes when I'm counseling couples, it seems to me that it's awfully important to say, okay, now things aren't perfect, but why did you think they were going to be? And if you are trying to, as a husband or as a wife, if you are trying to get your spouse to do things exactly as you want, so it seems perfect to you, you are engaged in a task that is not going to be fulfilled. It's not possible. We have to just recognize that this life is such that marriage, as wonderful as it is, I think it's the most sanctifying of experiences for most of us. In the Old Testament, getting married was so much what was expected to happen to everyone that there's not even a word for bachelor. And so when Jeremiah is told that he can't marry, this is an absolutely awful thing. There's not even a word for it. And when God said, the only not good in the whole creation account, it is not good for the man to be alone, it was because we need the marriage relationship in order finally to be drawn out of our selfishness and so on and so forth. But in the midst of that, it means it's not going to be perfect. And if we don't recognize that, and if we don't recognize that rearing children is often going to involve sorrows and fears and all the rest, then we're going to think that, well, God isn't being the person that I've always expected him to be, and there's something wrong with him.
Mm.
rather than recognizing that, no, this comes out of the fall. One of the points that I make, Travis, and I'm sure you caught it, was that God actually increased the amount of suffering in the world in Genesis 3:15 through 19. He said that he was going to cause animosity between the serpent and the woman. With the woman, he's going to cause her, depends on the translation you read for whether or not it's the word cause is there, but he was going to cause the woman to have pain in childbearing and so on and so forth. With the man, he curses the ground so that it's hard for the man to make a living. All of that is important. The suffering that God added to the world in everyday things is central to keeping us looking up at him. I say to my students, look, you're in college. You're supposed to be taking this to be at least the equivalent of a regular job. And that means at least 40 hours a week for the time you're in class, 2 hours outside class for every hour in and working on things. Of course, I don't particularly like to hear this, but I say to them, if you're not tired at the end of the day from having worked, you haven't worked hard enough.
Mm. And how do they respond to that?
They usually hear it, and it's pretty seldom that I get somebody say, no, I'm not going to believe that. But my guess is that it strikes them as a stretch. This idea that life isn't supposed to be just pleasant, which of course has been the American way of looking at it for years now, that in fact life is supposed to be difficult, that Adam had to scratch his living from the ground, is something that we, particularly in the prosperous 1/3 West, just don't recognize anymore in the way that we need to. It's the other 2/3 of the world that understands that life is not going to be just one pleasant experience.